Pay attention to this footage captured over an industrial compound in rural Arizona. You're looking at what appears to be storage units behind a manufacturing facility, but notice those wire structures in the open lot. See how they're positioned in the scorching desert sun, surrounded by barbed wire fencing? Watch closely as the camera pans across them. Those aren't equipment storage, those are cages. Human cages. And what investigators found inside them would expose one of the most disturbing workplace abuse cases in American history. This is the story of how one man's twisted obsession with control turned a factory into a torture chamber, and how his own brother became his first victim. You know that feeling when you take a job because you desperately need it, even though something feels off? For the workers at Thornhill Manufacturing in Mesa, Arizona, that uneasy feeling would turn into a nightmare they'd never forget. Thornhill Manufacturing wasn't anything special. It was one of those mid-sized factories that dot the Arizona desert, producing industrial parts for construction equipment. The kind of place where people clocked in, did their jobs, and clocked out. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. And in a small town like Mesa, jobs like that mattered. The factory had been around since the early 2000s, started by two brothers who'd moved out from California looking for cheaper land and lower taxes. By 2014, it employed about 40 people: welders, machinists, assembly line workers, warehouse staff, regular folks trying to make a living. But there was something about the place that made people uncomfortable. The turnover rate was high, really high. People would work there for a few months, then suddenly quit without explanation. Some wouldn't even give notice. They'd just stop showing up. And it all seemed to center around one person: Caleb Thornhill. Caleb was 54 years old in the summer of 2014, and he'd been the floor supervisor at Thornhill Manufacturing since he and his brother founded the company. He was a tall, lean man with weathered skin from years in the desert sun, and he had this intensity about him that made people nervous. His eyes had this way of boring into you when he talked, like he was searching for any sign of weakness or deception. Former employees described him as old-school strict, the kind of boss who'd write you up for being 30 seconds late, who'd inspect your workstation with military precision, who'd publicly call you out in front of everyone if you made even a small mistake. But here's the thing, people tolerated it because jobs were hard to find. You learned to keep your head down, do your work, and stay off Caleb's radar. That was the survival strategy at Thornhill Manufacturing. Then in November 2012, Caleb's wife of 26 years filed for divorce. And that's when everything changed. The workers noticed it almost immediately. Caleb, who'd always been strict, became something else entirely. Something darker. It started small. He began implementing what he called an accountability system. If you were late, you didn't just get written up anymore. You had to stand in front of the entire shift during the morning meeting while Caleb listed your failures. If you made a mistake on a part, you had to personally pay for the materials out of your paycheck. If you took too long on a bathroom break, you had to work through your lunch. 28-year-old Marcus Riley had been working at Thornhill for about 6 months when things started getting really weird. Marcus was a good worker, reliable and skilled. He'd been hired as an assembly technician and generally kept to himself. But in April 2013, he accidentally damaged an expensive piece of machinery while trying to clear a jam. The machine was one of those industrial cutters worth about $15,000. The damage wasn't catastrophic, maybe $2,000 to repair, but it meant the production line would be down for a day while they fixed it. Marcus reported it immediately to Caleb, expecting to get chewed out, maybe written up. What he didn't expect was what came next. "You need to understand the consequences of carelessness," Caleb told him, his voice eerily calm. "Come with me." Marcus followed him outside to the back lot of the facility, out past the loading docks, past the dumpsters, to an area where old equipment was usually stored. Except now there was something new out there. Wire structures. Cages, made from chain-link fencing and metal posts surrounded by barbed wire. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his stomach dropping. "Your correction chamber," Caleb said. "You're going to spend some time out here thinking about the cost of your mistake, about responsibility, about what it means to be accountable." Marcus thought he was joking. He had to be joking, right? But Caleb wasn't smiling. He opened the cage door, a crude thing held shut with a padlock, and gestured inside. "Get in." "You're serious?" Marcus backed away. "No way, man. This is crazy." But Caleb had his phone out now, scrolling through something. "I have your file right here, Marcus. Let's see. You've got a previous DUI, some unpaid child support. You really want to lose this job? You think anyone else in Mesa is hiring right now?" Marcus felt trapped. He needed this job. His ex-wife was already on him about the support payments. He couldn't afford to get fired. And maybe, he thought, this was just Caleb trying to scare him. Maybe he'd let him out after a few minutes once he'd made his point. So Marcus climbed into the cage. Caleb locked it behind him and walked away. That was at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The temperature in the Arizona desert that day reached 94 degrees. Marcus spent 3 days in that cage. Let me paint you a picture of what that was like. The cage was maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, not tall enough to stand up straight in. The desert sun beat down relentlessly, turning the metal frame scorching hot. There was no shade, no protection. Caleb would come out twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, to give Marcus a bottle of water and a protein bar. "How are we feeling about responsibility now?" he'd ask, his voice taking on this almost therapeutic tone, like he was a counselor helping someone through a breakthrough. Marcus would beg to be let out. He'd apologize. He'd promise to be more careful, but Caleb would just shake his head. "You're not ready yet. I can see it in your eyes. You haven't truly understood." The nights were almost as bad as the days. The temperature would drop into the 40s, and Marcus would shiver uncontrollably in his work clothes, trying to curl into the corner where 2 fence sections met to preserve any body heat. On the 3rd day, Caleb finally opened the cage. "I think you've learned your lesson," he said, helping Marcus to his feet. The younger man could barely stand. He was severely dehydrated, sunburnt, and disoriented. "Now, we don't talk about this. This is between you and me. Part of your personal development. Understand?" Marcus nodded, too weak and confused to do anything else. "Good. Take the rest of the day off. I'll see you back at work tomorrow." Marcus went home, drank what felt like gallons of water, and collapsed into bed. When he woke up the next morning, his skin blistered and peeling, he made a decision. He was going to the police. But then he stopped. What would he tell them? That his boss had put him in a cage? It sounded insane, and Caleb had made it clear he had dirt on Marcus, real legal troubles that could blow up his life. Plus, he needed this job. Without it, he'd violate his child support agreement and could end up in actual jail. So Marcus did what seemed like the only option at the time. He went back to work and kept his mouth shut, and that's exactly what Caleb was counting on. Over the next 14 months, the cages became a regular feature of life at Thornhill Manufacturing. But here's what made it even more horrific. Nobody talked about it. It was like this dark secret that everyone knew but no one acknowledged. If you made a mistake, you went to the cages. If you were late too many times, you went to the cages. If Caleb decided you weren't showing proper respect, you went to the cages. The duration varied. Sometimes it was just a few hours, sometimes overnight. For serious infractions, it could be days. 32-year-old Jessica Chen spent 18 hours in a cage after she talked back to Caleb during a staff meeting. 41-year-old Raymond Brooks spent 2 days there for accidentally backing a forklift into a support beam. 24-year-old Tyler Morrison spent 4 days for failing a random drug test, even though it was just marijuana he'd smoked on his own time over the weekend. By June 2015, at least 7 employees had experienced Caleb's correction program, and every single one of them stayed silent. The fear was too great, the economic pressure too intense. Caleb had carefully selected his targets, people who had something to lose, people who couldn't afford to make waves. He kept detailed records too, which investigators would later find almost more disturbing than the cages themselves. In a locked filing cabinet in his office, Caleb maintained what he called his behavioral improvement logs. Each employee who'd been caged had a file with dates, duration, temperature readings from a weather app, and Caleb's handwritten observations about their progress. Subject shows improved deference, one entry read. Eye contact still defiant, but posture more submissive. Recommend additional session if behaviors regress. Subject demonstrates understanding of accountability structure, another noted. Crying decreased after day 2, appears ready for reintegration. He genuinely believed he was helping them. In his twisted mind, this was a revolutionary management technique. He was teaching responsibility, discipline, respect for authority. He'd convinced himself that traditional HR methods were too soft, too permissive. His way was harder, yes, but it produced better workers. More compliant workers, more grateful workers. The really chilling part? It was working, at least in the short term. The employees who'd been through the cages were model workers afterward. They never missed a shift. They never complained. They worked overtime without being asked. They practically worshipped Caleb out of sheer terror. But by July 2015, Caleb's system was about to unravel in the worst possible way. Tyler Morrison's girlfriend, Sarah, hadn't heard from him in 4 days. This wasn't normal. Tyler always called her even if he was working late. They'd been together for 2 years and were talking about moving in together. He wasn't the type to just disappear without a word. She'd tried calling him, texting him. Nothing. She'd driven by his apartment. His car was gone. She'd even called Thornhill Manufacturing, but the person who answered said Tyler was on assignment and couldn't come to the phone. On the 5th day, Sarah walked into the Mesa Police Department and filed a missing person report. Detective Angela Rodriguez caught the case. She was a 12-year veteran of the department, smart and thorough. Missing persons cases involving adults were always tricky because people had the right to disappear if they wanted to. But something about Sarah's story bothered her. The girlfriend seemed genuinely confused and worried, not like someone whose boyfriend had just ghosted her. Rodriguez started by going to Tyler's apartment. The landlord let her in. Everything looked normal. Clothes in the closet, food in the fridge, mail stacking up. It didn't look like someone who'd planned to leave. Then she went to Thornhill Manufacturing. Caleb met her in the lobby, all professional courtesy. "Of course I'll help however I can, Detective. Tyler's a valued employee." "When did you last see him?" Rodriguez asked, noting Caleb's slightly too steady gaze. "Last Tuesday. He left at the end of his shift, around 4 p.m. Haven't seen him since. I assumed he was sick or dealing with some personal issue." "You didn't call to check on him? You said he's a valued employee." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're not a babysitting service, Detective. Our employees are adults. If Tyler needs time off, he knows how to request it." Something felt off. Rodriguez had interviewed enough people to know when someone was being too rehearsed, too controlled, but she didn't have any evidence of wrongdoing. She thanked Caleb for his time and left, but she made a note to dig deeper into Thornhill Manufacturing. What Detective Rodriguez didn't know was that at that very moment, Tyler was in one of the cages behind the building, barely conscious after 4 days in the brutal July heat. Caleb waited until the detective's car was out of sight, then walked out to the back lot. He stood in front of Tyler's cage, looking down at the young man who was curled in the corner, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. "You told someone," Caleb said, his voice cold. "No," Tyler croaked. "I didn't, I swear." "Your girlfriend filed a police report. A detective just left. You must have told her something before I brought you out here." "I didn't tell her anything. She's just worried because I haven't called." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he unlocked the cage. "Get up. We need to make you presentable." He helped Tyler inside, forced him to shower and change clothes, and had him drink water slowly so he wouldn't throw up. Then Caleb handed him his phone. "You're going to call Sarah. You're going to tell her you needed some space, that you went camping to clear your head. You're going to sound normal and happy. If you say one wrong word, if you even hint at what's been happening here, I will destroy you. Do you understand?" Tyler nodded, too scared and exhausted to resist. The call went exactly as Caleb scripted. Sarah was relieved to hear from Tyler, though she was hurt that he just disappeared. Tyler promised to see her that weekend, apologized for worrying her, and hung up. "Good," Caleb said. "Now get back to work." Tyler stumbled onto the factory floor, his co-workers avoiding eye contact. They all knew where he'd been. They'd all heard the rumors or experienced it themselves, but nobody said a word. Detective Rodriguez didn't buy Tyler's camping story. When she interviewed him 2 days later at Sarah's insistence, she noticed he had severe sunburn on his face and arms, and he moved like someone in pain. His hands trembled when he picked up the coffee she'd brought him. "Are you all right, Tyler?" she asked. "Yeah, fine. Just tired from the camping trip." "Where'd you go camping?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Up near Flagstaff. Nice area." "Which campground?" Another pause. "Just, some dispersed camping spot. Don't remember the exact location." Rodriguez let it go, but her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. After the interview, she went back to the station and started researching Thornhill Manufacturing more thoroughly. The company had no serious violations on record. A few minor OSHA complaints over the years, nothing unusual. The employee turnover rate was high, but that wasn't illegal. She requested employment records, but the company's lawyer blocked her, citing privacy concerns. Then Rodriguez got a break. A former Thornhill employee named Marcus Riley called the station. He'd heard through the grapevine that police had been asking questions about the company. He wanted to talk, but he was scared. Could they meet somewhere private? They met at a coffee shop in Phoenix, about 40 minutes from Mesa. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in days. He ordered a coffee with shaking hands and sat across from Rodriguez. "I need to tell you about Caleb Thornhill," he began, "about what he does to people out there." And then Marcus told her everything, about the cages, about his own 3 days locked in the desert heat, about the other employees he knew had suffered the same fate, about the culture of fear that kept everyone silent. Rodriguez listened, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Why didn't you report this when it happened to you?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I was scared. I needed the job. He had dirt on me, my DUI, the child support issues. I thought if I just kept my head down, it would be okay." Marcus's voice broke. "But it's not okay. What he's doing to people, it's torture, and I don't think he's going to stop." "Are you willing to give an official statement? Go on record?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I can't keep living with this." Rodriguez had enough for a search warrant. Within 2 days, she had a judge's signature, and on July 23, 2015, Mesa police descended on Thornhill Manufacturing with a warrant to search the premises. What they found was worse than they'd imagined. The cages were exactly where Marcus said they'd be, behind the main building in an area partially obscured by old equipment and storage containers. There were 7 of them total, arranged in a rough semicircle. Wire mesh walls, barbed wire tops, padlocks on crude doors. The ground inside each cage was dusty and stained, and there were empty water bottles scattered around. But it was the 8th cage that made Detective Rodriguez's blood run cold. This one was different, larger, maybe 8 by 8 feet, with a taller frame. The lock mechanism was more elaborate, clearly designed to be impossible to open from the inside. And unlike the others, which showed signs of regular use and maintenance, this one looked older, weathered, like it had been there much longer. Inside, partially covered by wind-blown sand, were items that suggested long-term habitation: a stained blanket, the remains of food wrappers, a plastic bucket that had clearly been used as a toilet, and scratch marks on the metal posts, deep grooves that looked like someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. "Bag everything!" Rodriguez told the forensics team. "I want this whole area processed." Meanwhile, other officers were searching Caleb's office. That's where they found the filing cabinet, the behavioral improvement logs, 7 employee files, each documenting sessions in the cages with disturbing clinical precision. Dates, times, temperatures, observations. It read like a researcher documenting lab experiments, except the subjects were human beings. But there was an 8th file in that cabinet, and the name on it wasn't an employee of Thornhill Manufacturing. It was Leonard Thornhill. Caleb's brother. The file was thicker than the others and dated back to January 2013. Rodriguez opened it with a growing sense of dread. The first entry read, "Subject requires intensive correction for financial irresponsibility and betrayal of family trust. Traditional methods have failed. Implementing enhanced accountability protocol." The entries went on for pages. Leonard had borrowed $20,000 from Caleb to pay gambling debts and had failed to repay it. Caleb had given him chance after chance, he claimed, but Leonard kept lying, kept gambling, kept making excuses. So Caleb had decided his brother needed the same kind of correction he would later use on his employees. Except Leonard's correction wasn't measured in hours or even days. According to the log entries, Leonard had been in that 8th cage for 96 hours straight in the middle of January 2013, 4 full days and nights. The temperatures that week had been unusually cold for Arizona, dropping into the 30s at night. The final entry was dated January 18, 2013. "Subject unresponsive this morning. Intervention failed. Will handle cleanup and ensure no trace remains." Rodriguez immediately called for cadaver dogs. By this point, Caleb had been taken into custody. He sat in the interrogation room with his lawyer, refusing to speak. But his record spoke for him. The logs were so detailed, so methodical, that they painted a complete picture of his crimes. The cadaver dogs hit on an area about 200 yards behind the factory, out in the open desert. The excavation team started digging, and 6 feet down, they found human remains wrapped in plastic sheeting and construction tarps. The medical examiner would later confirm that the body was Leonard Thornhill, Caleb's 49-year-old brother. Cause of death was exposure, hypothermia combined with severe dehydration. He died slowly and painfully while his own brother documented his decline. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of media coverage and investigation. 7 employees came forward to give statements about their time in the cages. Jessica Chen described her 18 hours of hell. Raymond Brooks talked about the 2 days he'd spent believing he might actually die out there. Tyler Morrison, who'd only just escaped before the police raid, spoke about the psychological torture of knowing no one would help him. But here's what haunted everyone involved in the case: the security footage. During the search warrant execution, investigators had seized the facility's security camera system. Caleb had cameras covering the entire property, including the back lot where the cages were located. He'd kept months' worth of footage on a digital server, supposedly for security purposes. But what investigators realized was that Caleb had been watching. He'd had a monitor in his office where he could observe the cages in real time. The drone footage that would later be shown in court had been captured by an industrial surveying company that had flown over the property in June 2015 while doing mapping work for the county. The surveyor had noticed the strange structures and had flagged it as unusual, but hadn't followed up. That footage became crucial evidence, showing the scope and deliberate construction of Caleb's torture compound. The security camera footage was even more damning. It showed Caleb visiting the cages multiple times per day, standing and watching the people inside. Sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more, just watching, observing, taking notes on his phone. In one particularly disturbing clip from March 2014, you could see Caleb standing in front of Marcus Riley's cage during the young man's 3-day ordeal. Marcus was clearly in distress, curled in the corner, and Caleb just stood there, watching, his body language suggesting not concern, but clinical interest. The footage from January 2013 showed similar visits during Leonard's imprisonment. In the final 24 hours before Leonard died, Caleb had visited the cage 4 times. Each time, he would stand and watch his brother, who was barely moving by that point, and each time he would walk away without opening the door. Dr. Patricia Simmons, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Caleb, diagnosed him with a severe antisocial personality disorder with delusional features. He genuinely believed his correction program was beneficial. He saw himself not as a torturer, but as a reformer, someone willing to do the hard work that soft modern society wouldn't do. In his mind, he was the hero of this story, Dr. Simmons testified later. He believed he was teaching accountability, building character, creating better people. The fact that he was actually committing acts of torture didn't register because he'd constructed this elaborate justification system. The investigation expanded beyond just the cage victims. Detectives interviewed dozens of former Thornhill employees who'd quit over the years. Many reported that while they hadn't been caged, they'd witnessed Caleb's increasingly erratic and abusive behavior. Several mentioned seeing the cages being constructed, but assumed they were for equipment storage. One employee said she'd heard screaming from behind the building one night, but had been too afraid to investigate. The community of Mesa was in shock. This had been happening for over 2 years, at a business operating in plain sight, and no one had stopped it. How had it gone on so long? How had no one noticed? But that's the insidious nature of workplace abuse, especially in places where people are economically vulnerable. Caleb had systematically targeted employees who were in precarious situations. People with criminal records who'd struggle to find other work, people with child support obligations who couldn't afford to lose income, undocumented workers who were terrified of any interaction with authorities. He'd created an environment where speaking up felt more dangerous than enduring the abuse. The forensic analysis of the eighth cage revealed something that would break the case wide open in terms of premeditation. Soil samples and weather data analysis showed that Leonard had indeed died of exposure during an unseasonably cold week in January 2013. But here's what made it murder rather than manslaughter. Caleb had checked the weather forecast before putting Leonard in the cage. Investigators found the weather app searches on his phone. He'd known the temperature was going to drop into the 30s. He'd known his brother was at risk, and he'd left him out there anyway. More than that, the security footage showed Caleb bringing a space heater out to the back lot on the second night of Leonard's imprisonment. For a moment, it looked like he might show mercy. But instead of putting the heater near the cage, he set it up about 20 feet away in a covered area and sat in a lawn chair, warming himself, while his brother froze in the cage. He sat there for 2 hours, reading on his phone, while Leonard screamed and begged to be let out. That footage made hardened detectives sick to their stomachs. It showed the level of cruelty Caleb was capable of. It wasn't just about punishment or his twisted idea of correction. There was genuine sadism there, a pleasure in having absolute power over another person. The trial began in March 2016 and lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the logs, the security footage, the testimony from 7 employees who'd survived the cages, the physical evidence from the facility, and the remains of Leonard Thornhill. Caleb's defense team tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming his divorce had triggered a psychotic break. They brought in their own psychiatrist, who testified that Caleb had lost touch with reality and genuinely believed he was helping people. But Dr. Simmons's testimony was more convincing. She pointed to the meticulous record-keeping, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, the destruction of evidence in Leonard's case. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and understood it was wrong. The prosecution also revealed something that hadn't been widely reported. Caleb had been researching alternative discipline techniques and behavior modification programs online for months before he built the first cage. His browser history showed visits to websites about military interrogation techniques, prison punishment systems, and even animal training methods. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment breakdown. It was calculated and planned. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. Marcus Riley took the stand and described his 3 days in the cage, his voice shaking as he recalled the terror and helplessness. Jessica Chen talked about the 18 hours she'd spent believing she might die, and how she'd wet herself because there was no bathroom, adding humiliation to the physical torture. Tyler Morrison explained how even after being released, he had nightmares about being locked back in the cage, how he couldn't be in confined spaces anymore without having panic attacks. And the prosecution played the security footage, hours of it. The jury watched as Caleb stood and observed people suffering. They watched him bring water bottles and set them just out of reach, making people beg for basic hydration. They watched the footage of Leonard's final hours, watching a man slowly die while his brother documented it like a science experiment. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and anger. Several victims were openly crying. Caleb showed no emotion whatsoever, his face a mask of controlled indifference even as the verdicts were read one after another. At sentencing, the judge called it one of the most disturbing cases she'd encountered in 23 years on the bench. You took vulnerable people who depended on you for their livelihoods and subjected them to torture. You murdered your own brother and then continued to refine your methods on other victims. You showed no remorse, no recognition of the humanity of the people you victimized. For the 7 surviving victims who'd experienced the cages, the impact has been profound and lasting. Marcus Riley suffers from PTSD and hasn't been able to hold down a steady job since 2015. Jessica Chen moved to another state and changed her name, trying to escape the memories. Tyler Morrison and his girlfriend Sarah eventually married, but Tyler still attends therapy twice a week. Several of the victims have filed civil suits against Thornhill Manufacturing's estate, seeking compensation for their trauma. The employees who worked at Thornhill but weren't caged have their own guilt to carry. Many have spoken about the shame they feel for not speaking up, for not helping their coworkers, for being too afraid to act. Survivor support groups have formed, bringing together both direct and indirect victims of Caleb's abuse. Leonard Thornhill's remains were finally returned to his family for a proper burial. His ex-wife and 2 adult children had reported him missing in 2013, but the investigation had gone cold. They'd spent over 2 years not knowing what had happened to him, never imagining the truth would be so horrific. The case sparked broader conversations about workplace abuse and the vulnerability of workers in precarious economic situations. Arizona passed new legislation in 2017 requiring more stringent oversight of industrial facilities and creating protections for workers who report abuse. It's called Leonard's Law, named for Caleb's first victim. Thornhill Manufacturing was shut down permanently. The facility sat abandoned for over a year before being demolished in 2017. The land is now a community garden, a deliberate choice by the city to transform a place of suffering into something that brings life and growth. Caleb Thornhill's charges included second-degree murder for Leonard's death, 7 counts of kidnapping, 7 counts of aggravated assault, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of workplace safety violations. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, plus 126 additional years for the other convictions. He's currently housed in a maximum security facility in Arizona, where he spends 23 hours a day in a cell. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The man who caged others now lives in a cage himself. When asked if he had anything to say to his victims during the sentencing hearing, Caleb spoke for the first and only time during the trial. "I did what I thought was necessary to build character and accountability. History will vindicate my methods." Even at the end, he couldn't see the truth of what he'd done, couldn't acknowledge the pain he'd caused, couldn't admit that his accountability system was nothing more than sadistic torture dressed up in the language of self-improvement. But his victims know the truth, and they're still here, still fighting to reclaim their lives from the trauma he inflicted. They're still surviving, which is more than can be said for Leonard Thornhill, who died cold and alone in a cage, watching his own brother choose cruelty over mercy. The desert cages of Thornhill Manufacturing are gone now, demolished and buried, but the scars they left remain, a reminder that the worst monsters aren't always strangers in the night. Sometimes they're the people we work for, the people we trust with our livelihoods and safety, and sometimes they're family. This case stands as a stark warning about the absolute power of employers over vulnerable workers, and about what can happen when that power falls into the hands of someone who lacks any shred of human empathy. It's a story of survival against unimaginable cruelty and of the courage it takes to finally speak up when everything in your life tells you to stay silent. For Marcus, Jessica, Tyler, and the other survivors, speaking up meant risking everything. But in doing so, they stopped a monster and ensured that no one else would ever be locked in Caleb Thornhill's cages again. And for Leonard Thornhill, who didn't survive, we remember that his death wasn't in vain. The law that bears his name has already protected countless workers from similar abuse, turning tragedy into a small measure of justice. Rest in peace, Leonard. Your story has been told, your death has been answered, and your brother will never hurt anyone again. End. Total runtime 51:30.